Cool. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome up the first speaker for the attendance.
If China decides to go to war on Taiwan, we cannot continue to export there. China is our main export market. To lose it would cripple our economy. 3 main substantive points for you in this debate. Firstly, how do we future-proof against economic shocks? Secondly, how do we build our domestic industries? And thirdly, Isabella will provide you a split on how we are more capable of sanctioning against bad actors. So before I get into my substantive points, 2 main points I've set up for you. Firstly, what does the status quo look like? New Zealand is an import-heavy country. Because of our geographical location, we have a lack of resources in dock ribbons, which means that we don't specialize in multiple fields. Our singular industry is agriculture. This is important for understanding the reliance on other countries. Secondly, what do we change? To simplify the info slide, we stand for being able to produce enough to be relatively self-reliant. There are multiple mechanisms for this under this info slide. What do we think that the negative team are going to stand for? They're going to have to stand for an increased reliance on other countries through trade and reducing regulations. So, moving on to substantives. How do we future-proof against economic shocks? We prove to you in this point that New Zealand is unprepared for increasing the number of economic shocks in the short and long term. We fix this. There are 3 mechanisms under this point. Firstly, why are economic shocks likely to increase in number? There are a number of factors that contribute to global supply and demand. They are unavoidable and they are likely to increase. Firstly, number of climate disasters are going to increase because of the global temperature increase to like 3 plus degrees. This means that things such as floods and droughts will impact global supply. Secondly, wars are going to be more frequent. Conflict is going to increase because of a scarcity of resources, which is just another factor for countries to fight over. Second mechanism, economic shocks are going to increase in severity due to the arms race, due to the development of technology. This means that outcomes of severity of conflict increases. We see this in continued development of nuclear weapons, AI, advanced drones.
POI.
Thirdly, how do we future-proof the economic shocks? Firstly, we predominantly have buying and selling to the domestic markets. This means that factors factors in the domestic market are able to control by the New Zealand government. They can do things such as implementing policies such as ensuring good ties with other countries, implementing policies to protect supply and demand such as seawalls and flood protection. Secondly, New Zealand is a less volatile market. Why is this? Because essentially we're at the edge of the world. We have a small population, which means we are just less volatile because we have less products, we have less resources that we can supply to other countries. What are some of the outcomes of this point? Because New Zealand relies a lot on supply and demand. This is this can be easily controlled on our side of the house because we're less volatile. This means that we get less of sudden drops in demand that causes bankruptcy, high prices for goods, such as when if China suddenly starts a nuclear war on Taiwan, or when a country cuts tie, it is crucial for us so that struggling families can survive, and then we can have substantial economic growth to support our economy and to support our country. So before I get into my second point,
So New Zealand's primary exports are agriculture. They're relatively inelastic, right? People need to eat. So what really changes if like China goes to war? Won't they still need to buy things to like eat?
Okay. Most of this, like, I don't understand how this is really relative, but, like, I've covered a lot about this in my points, which I've said, like, oh, we will, like, further improve how we can secure this, and, like, even if they say, oh, this doesn't impact as much, we can, on our side of the house, like, improve it for, like, ourselves. We can improve that we have, like, better, like, industries, and they are more secure on our side of the house. So, moving on to my points on how we benefit the domestic market. We can uniquely control national competition by among countries that like not only improves wages but it also like improves New Zealand specific innovation. 3 mechanisms under this point. Firstly, we get more companies on our side of the house because we are less reliant on importing. We have to rely on making our own things. This means that there are incentives for multiple companies to pop up and to like produce more products because we have like a big market, because we're like finally taking things into our hands and we're finally making sure that we don't have to depend on other countries. What does this essentially mean? This means that companies will increase their wages. Like there is like a finite like amount of wages. Why is this? Because companies want to only employ the best of the best, which means that in order to employ the best of the best, they will have to increase their wages so people actually want to join their company and people actually want to work for their companies. Note that this is extremely important preemptive material. So like if they want to come up next time like with their speech and prove that they emit like the cost of living, this is simply untrue because on our side of the house we get better wages for the economy, we get better conditions for our people. Secondly, on innovation. Because I proved to you in my first mechanism that we get more companies, this means that there's more competition in the market. What does this essentially mean for us? It means that when companies can compete for like large shares in the market and they are like incentivized to like improve the quality of their products because they want large shares in the market in order to get like a competitive edge for like to go over for them to get like the best quality products. This means that we get the best products for New Zealand that are New Zealand specific and like culturally sensitive products, such as like fishing companies starting to use like Māori science and knowledge to improve their products, which means that this gets better on our side of the house. So things work best. This means that under this mechanism, things work best with like New Zealand terrains and infrastructure. On the next side of the case, there is just not enough incentives for higher wages because there are less companies on their side of the house. They have less competition. They have less like good products coming out, which is on our side that is significantly better. Okay, what are some of the outcomes of this last point? Some of the 3 main outcomes for this last point. Firstly, we have more money for a higher standard of living. I've already proved to you in my first second point that we improve our wages, which means that we inherently like improve the quality of life and we like reduce like the cost of living in New Zealand. Secondly, we get more domestic industries. We get people coming into New Zealand more. We get people working in New Zealand, so our industries grow. Thirdly, we get less people leaving overseas and like fueling brain drain because people are incentivized to stay here more because we've got better companies, because these companies are incentivized to make the best product for us. This is why I'm extremely proud to negate.
Your hands.
It's fine.
You sure?
Yeah. Okay, give me a hand first. Okay, fine. Okay, never mind.
Nice. On the table.
Okay.
Thank you.
We're starting in 3, 2, 1. Why are we subsidizing and moving industries into New Zealand when it comes to real harmful impacts to the people of New Zealand in the small chance of a nuclear apocalypse or like some Terminator AI event that they're talking about? Okay, I'm going to firstly go on to some quick rebuttal, some like context and framing that's key to this debate, and just like how this negatively impacts the citizens of New Zealand, like this really real guaranteed impact that isn't as like small as like the risk of what they're saying. Okay, on to some rebuttal. Again, as Clara flagged to you, if China goes to war, they still need food. And even if you don't buy this, even if you buy that global trade for food just suddenly collapses in this, we can't diversify our economy. We're already very specialized in agriculture, right? This means that we're still not going to, on their side of the house, they're still not going to be getting money for agriculture. Note that economic shocks will still impact agriculture on this side of the on their side of the house. This is our comparative advantage on the world stage. Resilience-based policy is primarily about creating products within New Zealand in the event that a foreign producer can no longer produce them anymore. It's not about our exports, etc. But even then, I'll talk about that within our context and framing, which I'll move on to quite shortly. I just need to go over how the market is very small in New Zealand. We only have 5 million people to create products for. It's really unsure how we're going to suddenly get all these companies where they get companies where we suddenly have healthy competition for. It's really unlikely we're going to just find room in the market to create that healthy competition. Okay, moving on to some context and framing. What does resilience-based economic policy look like? It looks like subsidizing industries to help keep them local in case of ceasing production, right? Secondly, it just looks like stockpiling key products in case of ceasing production. Really obscure example of this in the Cold War, US stockpiled cheese because just in case production ceased, they want their citizens to eat cheese. 3. Just for national security in case of a global economic event. I think that's relatively intuitive. So the moderate version of this policy for the affirmative team should look like maybe creating baby formula within New Zealand instead of China. But if they think the impact or the risk of this apocalyptic event is really huge, they really need to be fighting for things like moving oil production to New Zealand, natural gas production to New Zealand, if they actually stand behind this risk being huge. Okay, again, what is New Zealand's comparative advantage? I don't really have to explain why this is true. Again, it's agriculture. They agree with us, and it's unlikely that we can change it to another industry just because New Zealand's geographical location, our soil, really is specialized for creating good beef and dairy products. And again, it's not particularly susceptible to economic shocks because it is an inelastic good. People still need to eat in the case of a war. And then even in the event of an apocalyptic breakdown where we don't have global trade anymore, we still have food, which is probably the most essential good. Okay, we think that actually the status quo within New Zealand is that we already are an efficiency economic-based policy is basically what the status quo is in New Zealand. Why is this true? Because New Zealand is such a small country, it's very hard to become self-sufficient and reliant and resistant to economic shocks, which the other team wants to propose. And as a small nation, we can't efficiently use economies of scale to move manufacturers here. For example, other countries like India and China utilize it. And secondly, New Zealand has a foreign policy of hedging, even if some political debacle goes down. Since we have such good cultural and economic ties with China and AUKUS, it's unlikely to impact our trade. Again, the only way that they can truly prove this impact is through this apocalyptic event which they're proposing, and I've already shown how the way that they're approaching it isn't as good. They need to be looking at oil and natural gas and other really essential things. And just thirdly, we lack expertise that comes with specializing our economy. Again from the debate we did against them previously, this looks like microchips, how Taiwan has a lot of experience with producing microchips. We can't move that over here. Again, just other things like electronics, etc. And but we are willing to also commit further to this efficiency policy in the nature of, for the nature of the debate. We are willing to cease to subsidize things like that TY aluminium smelter at the TY aluminium smelter in Invercargill because we are currently subsidizing their electricity heavily. And yeah, we're willing to like loosen foreign policy on allowing like permits of foreign companies to come in to increase competition, and we're also willing to lower taxes for foreign investments. Okay, yeah, I'll quickly take a bit one.
Why hasn't New Zealand entered into a free trade agreement with the USA?
Why? Well, I don't know. I think that just has a lot of like other factors surrounding it. I'm not like a super educated like economics nerds. I don't really see how that like. I don't really see the point of that in this debate. Okay, now moving on to like the first point, which is how having this efficiency based policy increases the quality of life for the average New Zealander. We've got 6 mechanisms here. This is a beefy point. Okay, the first mechanism is that producing things domestically in New Zealand is very expensive. Again, as I kind of flagged to you in my framing. Why is this true? Small population to produce, small population to sell things to. We are geographically isolated. Now we have to ship everything over there. And note that in the case that there's an apocalyptic event, we won't be able to like ship these things here. So we just like, we're stuffed either way. But like this risk is very low. Okay. Secondly, because we only have 5 million people to, like sell this to, but we still have to accommodate for the initial startup costs. Like a factory in Mexico is for making cars is still like a factory we have to build here, even though we're only producing substantially less cars. This is just going to be really, they're going to have to make it way more expensive. The cars cost to just justify the startup cost and actually to make a profit, which businesses are incentivized to do, unless of course our government like subsidizes it heavily, which has massive negative effects. Thirdly, products are lower quality because we're not like the best of the world in something. Like we're going to make really low quality microchips. We're going to make really low quality cars because we're not specialized in those areas. Fourthly, by making it but like as part of this efficiency policy, by making it easier for countries to invest and trade within New Zealand, it also makes it easier for us to trade with those countries, and it means it just moves towards better trade agreements. Like maybe we could move to a free trade agreement with the US if we allow them to invest more in our economy. The fifth one is that note that we have to actually subsidize the inefficient production of products within New Zealand, and that's just going to cost a lot more money. We're going to have to take money away from social welfare, etc. This is going to have a massive negative impact on the people. And like the sixth point is when New Zealand is buying goods from a global market, we actually have healthy competition because there are multiple producers to pick from. But on the contrary, we only have population to like justify one producer, which means that they can price gouge as much as they want since they're the only producer we buy from and there isn't healthy competition. What are the outcomes for this? Okay, for the average New Zealander, things are just a lot cheaper on our side of the house, right? Things like baby formula, electronics, petrol, steel, just everything is cheaper because we buy it overseas. Why is this important? Because like the most vulnerable people are can now afford the most basic expenses for their daily lives, and the quality of life is better because now people, instead of spending a ton of money on petrol, now they can invest in their child's education. And the second impact is that if we do move stuff here and make everything more expensive, and if we do try to like raise wages like they're proposing, this is just going to cause a cycle of inflation, which is going to cost the people of New Zealand even more. And we weigh this really heavily against like the non-substantiated risk of an apocalyptic fallout like they're promoting. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for the speech, and I welcome up the second affirmative speech.
think to start off this speech, I'm just going to explain to you why simply saying that countries will always need food is not enough to deal with all of the material we've given you about about all of the harms in the way in which they are able to cut off New Zealand, in which way they are able to harm our economies. So firstly, we tell you that if China suddenly goes to war with Taiwan, we simply cannot continue to export our food to China. Why is this? Because then we are seen to be supporting China, feeding their military soldiers, which will make us lose critical allies such as the USA that keep us safe. Secondly, we tell you that we are also talking about the change in the kind of consumption of the goods that we produce. We are talking about with climate change overseas, we may be likely to see more vegans, more vegetarians who don't like and won't consume the milk that we are producing. This is going to cause great economic shock to our country. But uniquely on our side of the house, our government is able to do things like promote the goodness of milk and have national campaigns. We also have a personal connection to farmers. That means that we're less likely to want to turn away from them. We're less likely to turn to other things. And we have a long historical connection to these sort of agricultural goods, which means that it is likely to be extremely stable. I think at the end of this point, basically what we tell you is that even if our main export, because our main export is food, and even though countries do need that, they still have the ability to cut us off, and that will still cause harm to our economy and to our markets. So what does this come down to then? What are the other things to talk about in this debate then? I think they tell us is that we are unable to protect ourselves against this economic shock because we are unable to build in self-reliance. I think firstly the thing to say is that we're just wanting to create the best possible conditions for New Zealanders to be able to produce whatever they might be able to. So if we allow them subsidies and if we drive up domestic competition and reduce international competition, then naturally the companies that are able to produce things such as maybe we produce milk because that's simply easier, but there may be other goods that we do have the resources for but we just aren't doing yet because of the startup costs, because of the international competition. So we think even though we aren't likely to get things like semiconductor chips being created in New Zealand, we are likely to get more of the other things that are critical in a time of crisis, such as more electricity, renewable electricity is being built in New Zealand, such as other the necessities that we need, wood not being only just shipped overseas to China, but wood being turned into things to build houses to keep people warm. We do need things other than food, and we think that these subsidies are likely going to allow New Zealanders to be able to produce those things within New Zealand. But what were some of the main pushbacks we got? So firstly we got is that it's extremely expensive. As I just flagged, we are able to provide subsidies, but also furthermore, we think that due to the competition element, the domestic competition, companies are likely to be able to find cheaper ways to make products and they're incentivized to do that. And so they're going to do it at a cheaper cost. Then secondly, they tell you that foreign investment is so major and we need we're going to be lacking foreign investment when we go in ourselves. We tell you when we're going to get a lack of foreign investment is on their side of the house and we continue to export food to China despite the fact that they're at war with Taiwan. On our side of the house, you continue to get general foreign investment because you want to have good ties, because you are still able to get an increase in profit out of the country. Those things, incentives still exist on our side of the house. So basically, and the other things that we tell you is that even though we are a small country, we do have a growing population. We aren't just stagnant. We think in the future it is completely unreasonable for them to expect that we are unable to grow into a country that is able to produce much, much more than we currently are. I think at the end of this point then, we tell you that even if we aren't able to get absolute reliance in which we are producing everything we need, yes, obviously that's unrealistic. What we are able to prove to you is that we get some of the critical things that we don't currently produce enough being produced in New Zealand, and we tell you that the right things will naturally be produced by the markets as we make it easy, and the ones that are easiest and have the lowest cost to be produced, but people will need the most, will be produced. So then basically what we move on to from this is a sort of competition thing, which I sort of talked about earlier on. I think what they tell you is that we tell you that you're likely, I'm just going to expand on this a bit more about why we get more competition. I think what it comes down to is that we are now likely to get more domestic competition, which is specifically good for getting the kind of like New Zealand specific benefits that Anshika was talking about. We think that when you are competing with other companies, you are unable to compete on wages because the people are literally in two different countries and not like competing for the same employee pool. And also we think that the kind of innovation that we are able to uniquely get on our side of the house may be beneficial to New Zealanders. Like, I'm just like the sort of things that Anshika was speaking about, right? About like being able to like specific to New Zealand terrain, specific to New Zealand infrastructure, like our weather may mean you require certain materials to build a house. Those are the things you're likely to innovate on our side of the house because you're not competing with all of these international things and generating useless products that don't actually benefit New Zealand. In terms of like, is subsidizing specifically bad for New Zealanders? They basically said that we get like huge harms and it's a huge cost to everyone. I think that ultimately when you invest in New Zealand companies, you are able to generate economic growth, which is going to drive the sort of and give you back the returns that you need in order to be able to make that investment. And let's just look at the comparative, right? We're literally talking about your markets being crippled due to climate change, due to escalating conflict. We did not hear any response to Anshika's material about how we are likely to get more conflict and we are likely to get more severe conflict. We're not talking about AI apocalypses. What we are talking about is if a single war breaks out, the harm is going to be so much more severe than just bayonet stabbing in the 1800s. We are going to get huge bombing. That is so bad and that is going to be so crippling for people's abilities to afford food, which they care about, to be able to like survive and feed your families. But just extending more on the kind of things we're able to do is able to, in my split, I'm going to be talking more about how we're capable of sanctioning bad actors. I think China is a great example of a bad actor that, for example, commits many human rights violations against Muslim minorities in its countries. Yeah. And there is also other bad actors like Russia, for example, that is literally at war with Ukraine. Why are we more likely to be able to sanction these actors? Before I move on, I will take a POI.
Why is China likely to care if we sanction them? Because of our asymmetric trade relationship with them, i.e. we send them a lot of our goods, but we barely get anything.
Because it's bad optics, right? We see that they have to stand up for Australia and they tell Australia, if you keep pushing the line, we're just going to cut you off, and we'll go to India, for example, that also produces milk. It is bad for the CCP to be like appearing to just like letting countries get away with condemning it on the international stage. That creates like internal turmoil within the country, which they just simply cannot allow to go by. So how are we able to better sanction bad actors? Because we think that, as I was saying, bad actors have an incentive to cut us off because often they are large countries that can simply turn to other markets, but they are also wanting to maintain good optics and not have countries being seen to condemning them. We think that we are likely to be able to do things like tell China, like impose sanctions on China, which may not have great economical effect, but what they do is send a signal to the USA, to the UK, a long-standing ally since the 1800s, that we are still in support with them, which is so crucial in the kind of escalating tensions that Anshika was talking about, that we are able to maintain these strong connections, that we are able to sanction bad actors.
I thank the speaker for the speech. I'd like to welcome up the second negative speaker to continue the text case.
I would very much like to see F justified to a single mother who in their world has to water down her baby formula because prices have gone up so much to justify a pretty uncertain future risk of an economic harm, and notably also not an economic harm that they haven't proved we can bounce back from, right? There have been recessions before. New Zealand has figured it out, right? I don't necessarily think it's like the apocalyptic world-ending scenario they want you to believe it is to have like an economic harm in the short term, possibly 10 years from now. 3 things to do on my speech. Firstly, on vulnerability, and is it actually like as bad as they want you to believe? Secondly, on what their world actually looks like in terms of investment in New Zealand. And then lastly, on stuff around innovation and like domestic companies. Okay, firstly then, on vulnerability. They tell you that New Zealand is really unprepared for the crises that they predict are going to increase in the future. They give you examples of like climate, war, and also just like a possible apocalyptic scenario that they kind of maybe walk back on a little bit at second. I think first thing to note here, insofar as like the climate goes, this is probably actually just fine for New Zealand's industries, right? Because if other countries are impacted a lot worse, then you as the main agricultural producer that doesn't suffer quite so much from climate change because you know have like higher land and also are further away from the equator, probably just get better off. It's the same thing that's happening in Scandinavia, right? Increases in like global warming are actually just really great for the Scandinavian export industry, which is like true, sorry. But also, secondly then on war, I think again we tell you Sam, it's pretty unclear to me why it's necessarily true that a country that is involved in conflict like suddenly stops kind of importing stuff from China. The material that we hear is that like it's really bad for New Zealand's optics to be feeding China because it's like, you know, looks like we are like going against our allies. First thing to note is that actually we're not technically allies with like the US, we're just kind of friends. They can't stop us from like feeding China. I think they're pretty well able to understand that we have our own economic incentives. But if the allies really, really do want us to not be feeding China, they probably just have an incentive to buy up our like exports instead. I think that's probably fine. I think that probably absorbs the risk that they want to talk about there. But the last thing I want to note, and 2 last things to know, I think in the worst apocalyptic scenario that they do mention, which is literally just like a nuclear fallout, whatever, probably the debate just doesn't happen, right? The world probably just like that's over. But in a more moderate scenario where there is some kind of short-term economic harm, New Zealand has bounced back from a recession before. And notably what they don't prove to you is that we have the capacity to have the technologies that are especially important, right? They literally don't provide you a single example of a technology we likely to get. They just say like the free market will work it out. But things like ventilators, like high-tech things like devices, things like, you know, maybe irrigating technology, these are the most high-tech. These are the things that we are least able to produce in New Zealand. I am really unclear about why I think we specifically need to survive in this scenario are any better off under their side of the house. I think what that means at the end of this is I'm pretty unclear as to why New Zealand is actually better equipped for future risk under their side. Because if we do make baby formula in-house and there's an economic recession, like we still can't get ventilators, right? We still can't get all these other things that are so bad. I think there's probably just not really clear how there's a debate-winning benefit there. So I think what the debate then comes down to is the way that industry interacts with the everyday consumer in New Zealand. Before I get into this point, I will take a POI.
Is a bust necessary for a boom in the economy?
I really don't understand the point of that POI, I'm not going to lie. Okay, let's talk then about the interaction of economics and like the everyday New Zealand citizen. They want to tell you that innovation is so much better for 2 reasons, right? Firstly, that we get products from New Zealand that are more culturally like significant, and secondly, that these like countries have competing incentives when we have all of these domestic companies. Note that all of their innovation material is contingent on the idea that we're going to have more domestic companies. But no, two responses here. Firstly, we have a very limited amount of money for the subsidies they want to provide, especially given the more industries we want to bring home to New Zealand, the more stretched our subsidy money is. That means you probably only like subsidize one baby formula manufacturer, one like oil and gas manufacturer, one like, I don't know, battery manufacturer or whatever. That means there's absolutely zero competition. This has 2 very, very bad impacts. The first of which is that these companies can extort the everyday New Zealander as much as you like. If you think the supermarket duopoly is bad, imagine how bad it's going to be when all of the industries that New Zealand relies on and that they want to tell you are important can extort us for literally as much money as they want. Know that the comparative is New Zealand plays off international manufacturers to get the best deal, right? Maybe we talk to like a baby formula manufacturer in China, one in Mexico, and one in like Sweden, and there is the competitive pressure that they want to talk about gets
lower prices exist there. But the second thing to note here is that domestic companies, like we tell you at STEM, just produce worse products. This was true for 3 reasons. Firstly, we don't have the expertise in New Zealand, and it's pretty unclear how we're going to steal away the experts who already work for the awesome companies to come to these new companies we're establishing in New Zealand. But the second thing is just the market here is extremely limited. There is a scale to which you're doing this production is really small, right? Because if you're literally only providing something for 5 million people, there are just not a lot of people to be there's not you don't need a very large factory or whatever. And the other thing that this means, to be totally knows what this stands, is that these things have another reason that they have to be more expensive, right? And that's just you have to still pay these setup costs, but now you just can't distribute them against as wide of an audience. That's a massive harm because it means these things are much more expensive for New Zealanders. I think the last thing to note here is that they tell you that we're going to get really good salaries for domestic New Zealanders, but I actually think there's a really big harm here because if you get all these new domestic corporations that spring up in their world, in their best world, where you play off a lot of them, they are going to fail. Why? Because they cannot afford to exist for a long time, right? Maybe you get the battery factory for 1 or 2 years, but eventually when the market dries up because it's really small and New Zealanders have just stocked up on their batteries, the company fails. That's a big problem, right? Because all these everyday New Zealanders who were previously employed in relatively stable industries and moved over to the battery factory now just have no job, right? If they want to talk about sudden economic impacts, I don't think there's a more sudden economic impact than the factory you work for closing down, and there's no other battery factory in New Zealand, so there's nowhere for you to go, right? That's when you leave people the most unemployed in the most terrible way in this debate. I want to also push now onto a new piece of substantive because they are so unclear as to what they envision the industries that they're going to be investing in alike. So I'm going to talk about their worst case where they start to invest in oil and gas, and note that this is more and more likely the more and more they want to catastrophize, right? Because if the world is so unstable, then it is necessary for New Zealand, or at least New Zealand will perceive it to be necessary, to start investing in oil and gas. Because these things are high risk because of transport lines, right? But also because we do theoretically have access around our seabed. There are 3 reasons this is really bad. Firstly, you get new environmental damage, right? Because instead of just having a oil rig that was already established somewhere else, you have to build a new one in New Zealand. Not only is that expensive, but you damage the seabed here, you leak pollution to the ocean. That's really bad. But it also there's a massive harm to Te Ao Māori, right? You steamroll over the treaty when you decide, yes, let's build lots of oil and natural gas in New Zealand for the sake of being self-sufficient. That's a massive, massive harm. The last thing to note at this point is the funding of the companies. They have to stand by supporting these companies with subsidies, and they do, right? But that comes at a massive opportunity cost, because the more you pay for these companies, they've already proven to you are very unviable, which means that the amount of money you have to provide to them is very high. The more you trade off on other things that New Zealand can give money to, and that's mostly the other functions of the government, things like providing welfare, things like building roads that make life easier for the everyday New Zealander, things like building a new port so we can get more international trade. Those are the biggest harms, right? Because not only is life more expensive, less high quality for the average New Zealander, but now they have less support for the government. So those safety nets you need in terms of economic harm disappear. You can't pay the welfare subsidy when you spend all your money funding useless factories.
Sorry, I thank the speaker for the speech and like to welcome up the third affirming speaker to the new words in this case.
It was never our burden in this debate to prove that we're going to be the next North Korea and be completely cut off from the global market. We concede that we literally cannot produce microchips at the point in which we don't have lithium, to which we don't have cobalt. We don't have to stand for this incredibly high burden they've placed on us. What we just need to prove is that there is significant harm to having entire reliance on the global market, and that as a majority rule, what is in our realm of control, we should subsidize and we should promote on our side of the house. That is what we need to convince you of. 3 questions in today's debate. Firstly, what is our capacity to diversify? Secondly, domestic competition. And thirdly, about global markets and about global markets. Firstly, on our capacity to diversify, we've had kind of weirdly fear negating material from AF that we literally can't diversify because we can't get all the mechanisms that were stated in the info slide. We can't subsidize because the pool of money isn't big enough, right? Why? And that we can't diversify because there's no incentive to, because we lack resource endowments. Firstly, right, we believe that resource endowments goes a lot further than just natural resources, because we can see we don't have those, but what do we have? We have expertise. We have the best universities in the country. We don't just have to focus on agriculture. We can focus on tertiary and quaternary industries like technology. Why can we get this on our side of the house? We can get this because we improve technology at the point in which we aren't relying on Silicon Valley in order to make all the technological developments. We can see this under status quo with companies such as Rocket Lab having organisations within New Zealand. We see this as a growing market, and we want to propel us into the future. We see that agriculture simply isn't enough. Secondly, though, on this, they want us to say things are going to be expensive to produce. As I already flagged, we probably have the fear in this debate to just assume that these subsidies are going to be quite large. If you don't buy that, we'll just say fine, we increase taxes for the wealthy or we redistribute funding. This is literally never going to be something they could have won on, right? Not strategic. But then what have they bring us about sort of inelastic markets? We're going to be easy to cut off, right? Firstly, China has other countries they can go to. Isabella gave you great material, because they're more likely to go to India, to go to Scandinavia in order to get their dairy. There's nothing implicitly special about New Zealand that makes them want to keep that try. Secondly, we believe they're likely to switch away from New Zealand at the point in which we are becoming a more progressive country. This means that we are likely to side with the USA on these issues, and therefore they're less likely to become reliant on us on dairy, right? This is why these economic shocks is so important, because as we have given you, global conflict is likely to increase over time. This has been strawmanned by NEG. At the point in which they think we're going to have Terminator 2 levels of AI development, what we actually said is that we're going to have increased warfare at the point in which technology is getting better, the threat is more imminent. We see global tensions brewing when people are speculating that Israel shot down the helicopter that President Raisi was on. These are the sort of things that are going to happen more as resources become more scarce, people fighting over land, fighting over water, fighting over religion. This is so much worse on our side because we have these things like drones, like AI, that is going to escalate these conflicts, even if it's not to full out war. But lastly, right, even if we can't convince you that that there's sort of inelastic markets, and therefore they still these people still need to eat, and therefore they're still going to choose New Zealand. Why are we different? Because when China has less of a market share in New Zealand, them wanting to change does not impact us enough. It's proportionality, and I think that has been crucially missed. Okay, at the end of this point, what have we proved to you? We've proved that we actually can diversify our industries if we get creative. If we look at sort of the more if we look at more tertiary and quaternary, we can do this. We've always had the capacity to on side NEG. Before I move on, a point if you have one.
Yeah, if you have a technological industry that's already pretty well developed, for example in Silicon Valley, what's the incentive for these experts to come move to New Zealand to help us develop our industry?
Okay, right. This is sort of I kind of addressed this in my POI about a free trade agreement where the United States has literally no incentive to into an FTA for us because it's literally worse off for them. We don't have this huge our global export market is blooming, yes, but we believe at the point in which Silicon Valley stuff isn't actually
actually getting here anyways. It's going to be more likely that we want to develop technology on our side. Right, competition in New Zealand. If I can prove to you in this point that we're likely to get more domestic competition from companies and reduce price gouging. This is important, especially when we look at that unresponded material about wages. Right. What have they brought you? They've said, well, how are we going to get more healthy competition if the market is so small? It's never been about the size of the market. It's been about the proportionality of the market share. So let's hypothetically, because team of 5 million, that's probably always going to stay the same, right? What's different? Now we have less domestic companies fighting for market share against New Zealand companies, which New Zealand companies almost never going to win, right? We don't have the economies of scale in order to compete with very cheap Chinese products influencing the New Zealand market. Therefore, when we have more New Zealand companies having that market share, we get more competition within those countries because they both have the subsidies. They're both on an equal playing field. They're more likely to compete on wages and stuff like that. Right. Secondly, though, why, even if you don't buy this material, why do people buy New Zealand products under the status quo? Because of these non-price factors we gave you in Shika. People genuinely like the quality of New Zealand products. New Zealanders like having that sort of 100% Kiwi national pride about buying milk from Fonterra or whatever. This is extremely amplified on our side of the house when it's not just products from overseas competing. We can actually compete on price and quality. We are able to cop both of those factors. Right. Lastly, about price gouging. They tried to say you are more likely to price gouge at the point in which you don't have domestic companies paying for competition. Firstly, the main thing here is you're more likely to price gouge under the status quo when there's one company that supplies the global demand. Literally, why is cheese so expensive? Why is fish so expensive? We literally live on an island. We literally, if agriculture is literally our biggest industry, I will tell you why. Because when we have one producer exporting to other markets like Fonterra, they're able to price gouge under the status quo because they are the only ones fueling this market. We're less likely to get competition because if we only have one really strong industry, we don't need multiple industries in the export market. At the end of this point, and lastly, just on wages, right? We're more likely to get better wages over time. This has gone critically unresponded to, incredibly important because New Zealanders need to get paid fairly for for their labour. They're more likely to do this domestic companies because of the specific laws we have regarding worker safety. Right. Lastly, then about global markets, which is them saying them trying to say that people we aren't friends with the USA, therefore we don't have an obligation to them as allies. It's still a pretty keen incentive for us to just remain neutral because it means that we have the political capital in order to go with whoever we want on the side of a conflict. We believe that is going to be incredibly important, especially as conflicts scale. But then they also try to argue that we're going to get bad optics because fertility is going to be ruined when we decide to start fracking. I'm sorry, we can't frack for natural resources that don't exist in New Zealand. And secondly, this is likely to not happen. As you said, we had the TY that thing at TL, the iron smelter or whatever, that got large public backlash. At the end of this point, who was the team that told you that we are going to get better data diversification? Team Hawke's back.
I thank the speaker for the speech, and I'd like to invite up the final substantive speech of the preliminary rounds of nationals, the third negative speech.
Sorry guys, he has to come up for the last substantive speech of the last preliminary round of the nationals. I think so.
In the middle,
I'll pick him up again after I'm done. He'll like that. not like that, guys. We have a very professional relationship. Okay. I'm just going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think in a world where AF claims so religiously to this info slide, which, by the way, was very unnecessarily complicated, they cannot claim such increased competitiveness in businesses, something that is inherently tied to our side of this info slide here, right? Okay, so for two main things to talk about in my speech. Firstly, is the tangibility of econ shocks and larger international cooperation and things like that. And then secondly, on domestic business, innovation, and that sort of theatre of the debate.
So in terms of economic shocks, what do we tell you, first of all, right? We tell you largely that climate change risks and these things actually make these goods cheaper for us to buy, right? This is a response from Clara that I'd like to whip because I think it's very important. As one of the main mechanisms that AF gives you as to why these economic shocks could be so pertinent is because of things like rising climate change, right? But we're in a world where we are disproportionately unaffected by climate change compared to other countries that we'll be buying from. This just actually makes for an economic, whatever the opposite of a shock is for us, right? As a discharge or something, right? In their world, right? They tell you that economic shocks are tangible because of climate change and war and things. They tell you that economic shocks are getting progressively worse because of nukes, AI, rising warfare, etc. They tell you that sanctioning of bad actors is more tangible because we're sending messages to the US, the UK, etc.
Yeah.
The first response to this, right, I feel like is fairly simple. Clara tells you, quite rightly, that we are not even technically an ally of the US, right? I feel like our sanctions on places like China are not going to have such a big impact on these geopolitical players. Why? Because I feel like a small nation of 5 million people like giving less Manuka honey to China is probably not going to impact US or UK or Australian foreign policy decisions when it comes to things like such as a war in Taiwan, right? Okay, secondly, you don't have the industries on the affirmative side that would be crucial in a conflict like this. What do I mean by this? Well, say we get into a situation where we need to sanction China, etc. We're involved in a conflict. The things that would be really pertinent there to have in New Zealand would be things like natural gas and oil. We already give you analysis as to why having these things would also be very, very bad, right? But the point is that these are the types of things that you would need in order to be more conflict efficient, and simply AF doesn't get them. Thirdly here then, these economic shocks are largely not as extreme as they claim. Why? Because in terms of the climate change ones, again, the effects on us are disproportionately less, right? So we actually don't have to worry about these largely. War, I feel like us sanctioning proves largely useless, right? You hear this stuff from Sam, again, about, our disproportionate asymmetrical trade relationship with China. We go, hey China, we're going to give you less meat. And China goes, that's fine, I've got 50 years stockpile worth of pork, that's fine. I'm just going to stop selling you 70% of your imports. Right? That is not a symmetrical thing. That is not a thing we can do. And we are not going to receive any pressure to have to do it because, as we've said before, the US, the UK, and Australia largely don't care. Right? So in terms of this point, this is really a very significant path to victory for AF here, right? Because a whole key component of AF's case is that they are sort of collecting and hoarding things in the instance that we cannot get them from other places, right? And this is significant because every day that there isn't a very harmful economic shock that affects us, right, we get great benefits because, as I'll go on to prove, that we get immense benefits to domestic business and the people of New Zealand, right? AF must prove then that not only are these things are likely, but they're sufficiently debilitating, right? Not only that they happen, but they cause significant economic distress. Also, they give a lot of different potential economic shocks, right? But I feel like when you look at AF's case reasonably, unless they all happen dramatically and significantly at relatively the same time, it's simply just a bunch of static. It's not a significant electrocution, right? So then let's move on to the big part of this debate about domestic business. What do we tell you in our world? We tell you that New Zealand struggles to diversify. The main things that we get profit from are things to do with our dairy industry, right? Our cows, etc., wine, cheese, whatever it is, right? We tell you that potential mono and duopolies are pretty significant if you don't have competition and if you're instead subsidizing these companies. Why? Because the New Zealand government can probably even barely afford to subsidize one of each genre of thing, right? We can maybe get, one Silicon Valley-esque, situation going on, but we can't have 5 of them and we can't get them all to compete with each other because that is simply not realistic, right? Tell you that subsidies are very expensive. No, we don't say that you can't do subsidies. You can do whatever you like with your money. But we think that subsidies are a really poor way of spending your money because they're very expensive and they don't lead to actually better outcomes for the average New Zealander. And we tell you that we get way cheaper and more expertly made goods, right? On their world, they have this big push about better wages and less brain drain. They tell you that they apparently get more competition and they tell you about better innovation specific to New Zealand, which is a big benefit that they try to claim. Okay, so 5 main responses here, right? Firstly, on competition, again, to use the oil rigs as an example once again, it takes quite a significant amount of oil rigs to make up for the usual competition that we have buying oil from all of the countries that produce oil, right? Instead, you're having to play all of these rigs against each other, right? This competition is then inherently less, unless you want to somehow discover a way to make a money trade. You cannot subsidize enough oil rigs to make up the same amount of competition, right? You have to make the trade-off that you get less competition here, right? So secondly, why is innovation innovation not very pertinent. I feel like this point is simply not mechanized well enough, right? The one example on houses being made out of like materials that are relatively useless for New Zealand, there is no real mechanization on how this could happen. Like, I don't imagine we're getting sold wood and stone and metal by other countries that like when it comes into contact with like kiwi fur, it just disintegrates, right? I feel like New Zealand is not significantly environmentally dramatic enough compared to other countries to the point where housing materials just crumble here and are useless, right? Thirdly, you can subsidize again, but it's just ridiculously expensive, right? Fourthly, universities, right, do not allow you to sufficiently replace things like Silicon Valley and other technological institutes. Even if you can, you're inevitably going to have way worse staff because, as Clara tells you, to not sufficient response, right? There is really no incentive for these staff to move over from the US to little old New Zealand, where they're going to get likely paid less, they're going to like struggle in their job, right? This means that they actually don't get more pay, they get worse pay, right? Because these companies are struggling economically, they're struggling to turn a profit, they cannot pay their employees more if they don't have any money, right? And fifthly, AF cannot have these better wages universally, right? Unless if their profits are so abysmal, again, right? So if you're having to pump loads and loads of subsidies into these businesses, if they don't suddenly start turning profits, all of these benefits of better wages simply don't happen, right? I'll take that POI before I move on.
How did Cyclone Gabriel impact Apple exports?
Affect what, sorry?
Apple exports.
Apple exports. To be honest, I have no idea. Yet again, I don't know how that really affects this debate dramatically. But yeah. So I feel like, so in terms of at the end of this point, right, why is this so huge? Because I feel like New Zealand's, again, this is not an actor debate, right? So why is this point about New Zealand so important? Because I feel like New Zealand's global impact is negligible, right? You buy that throughout our debate when we give you all of this analysis as to why New Zealand doesn't have the imperative to sanction people, and also why we tell you about New Zealand's sanctions potentially being quite useless because most countries simply don't care if we don't give them things, right? So then, at the end here, we inevitably have less good versions on the affirmative side of the industries, and we cannot play the foreign ones against each other for better prices. You cannot claim on the affirmative side here that you get more competition, because you simply cannot. It is not economically feasible for you to have more competition. Therefore, you have, right, these things costing more. You have the single mother, right, not being able to afford the baby formula for your child, or you just simply have these new Silicon Valley-esque things not being able to actually run economically beneficially, right? And also the huge opportunity cost here. The government could spend this money on so much better things. We're talking roads, schools, hospitals, and welfare things. I feel like in a world where you are sacrificing the unemployment benefit just so that we can make some phones in case, you know, China invades Taiwan, that is not a good benefit for any New Zealander, and therefore that is why I'm very, very proud to negate it. Thank you.
Thanks, speakers, for the speech. As is customary, we reverse the speaking order, so I'd like to welcome up the negative reply speaker.
Oh, sorry. Team Hawke's Bay may have told you they get better diversification, but at the end of the debate, they didn't prove it. Two things to do, and my leaders in two independent pathways to victory. Firstly, on who best provides for risk and on material and opportunity costs there, and then secondly, on impacts on the domestic economy and the everyday New Zealander. Okay, firstly, on risk. I think Shay does a great job of mitigating this at third, but I'm just going to bring highlight what's key here. Firstly, we tell you that there are actually just some benefits to New Zealand for climate change that mean that we have like an asymmetric economic advantage in that eventuality, but also that in the case of war, if the US really hates China so much, they just have an incentive to buy out our exports in order to like get China like a strategic disadvantage that probably means there's like no tangible harm to the New Zealand economy. But I want to note two things, right? AF never even tries to prove that they can't bounce back from an economic downturn. This means that if we can prove that the day-by-day harm outweighs like 2 years of building back from the Asian financial crisis, we just automatically win the debate, right? It's not clear to me why the risk of an economic harm is actually a debate-winning material, and I think it's probably a little bit late for that to come out at AF reply, right? But I think the second thing to note here is that they're actually far worse off in terms of risk, regardless. Why? Because when the government spends so much money propping up businesses, you trade off on other things like building infrastructure, the hospitals, the ventilators, the irrigators we need in the event of war, but
also you trade off on things like the benefit that impact the most vulnerable in the day-to-day, but particularly the unemployment benefit, right? If I think an economic crisis is imminent at the end of the debate, I would prefer to live in a world where the government can pay for me to be alive when I lose my job, right? I think that is pretty significantly an independent pathway to victory. We flagged this at SAM. I delivered it for you at second. We heard it again from Shay at third, and we never heard a response. I think that means that it's pretty clear that we can claim a big benefit here. But secondly, then, on the domestic economy, and again, if you're confused about risk, if you don't buy what I've just told you, this is an independent pathway to victory. I think three things are key here. Firstly, that New Zealand loses the ability to play off overseas suppliers. I gave you that example of the different baby formula suppliers in my speech. The reason why this is so important is it just means that things are more expensive, regardless of the other mechanisms we give you about economies of scale, about how far you just have to ship things into New Zealand to start building in the first place. The comparative was that you can only probably subsidize one of each of these self-sufficiency industries that you want to fund, right? That means that they just can extort New Zealanders. They just can be the new supermarket duopoly, but even worse, right? I think that's really bad because it means that the average New Zealander has to pay more for the essentials of their life, right? You pay more for petrol, you pay more for baby formula, you pay more for the battery and your phone. That means your life is worse. The most vulnerable people can't even afford to continue their lives the way they are now, but the average person just has a materially worse quality of life. They're sad on the day-to-day. Multiply that by every New Zealander and every day, I think that far outweighs an economic harm that maybe lasts for 2 years and they actually never really impact for you. I think the last thing to note here is that I also tell you in my speech that because we proved to you throughout our line, that these industries are just quite likely to eventually fail, right? When demand dries up because of how small New Zealanders, or just because the market isn't big enough to sustain them in the end, people's employment gets terminated. That's another harm where if you care about unemployment, this is when it's irreversible, right? Because there is no other job for you to go to because you left your other job and there is no battery factory once the battery factory has closed. Three things to buy at the end of this point. Firstly, high cost for the average thing for the everyday New Zealander. Secondly, lower wages because of smaller profit margins. But thirdly, we have industries that are bad. One, because they close down and can't support New Zealanders to live. But two, like I tell you at second, because some of them are just really bad for New Zealand, right? That's things like trying to invest in our own oil and gas that massively harm our economy, massively harm New Zealand's special relationship with the land. So much material we give you throughout our line that is never responded to and provides us with such great pathways to victory.
I thank the speaker for their speech, and now for the final speech of the day and the end rounds, I'd like to welcome up the affirming reply.
I think when the negating team time and time again says that we are so reliant on Russian oil and gas as a 90% renewable country, they have missed the point of this debate. Ultimately, on the side affirmative, we are still able to have access to global markets, but what we have to weigh up is that food alone is not enough to sustain us, that losing out on one singular market and then crippling our entire economy is simply not sustainable. What we do is we offer a viable alternative on side affirmative by propping up the initial costs for local companies. We get more companies, we get more things being produced, even if we don't produce absolutely everything in the world. As long as we prove to you that we produce slightly more to be able to benefit us, I think we win this debate. First thing in this debate, I'm going to be talking about the severe economic shocks that we are likely to be facing and how we are able to just rely on the USA and to get out of it. And secondly, how we are able to diversify and become a stronger economy, which also provides benefits to competition. So starting off with, on the economic shocks, I think we proved to you sufficiently in this debate that we are likely to get more severe and more numerous economic shocks, and they did not disprove this. What they simply did do was to say, well, no, the USA is just going to pay us off, and therefore we're not going to be harmed by these economic shocks. I think given throughout this debate, we've characterized the kind of markets of China as such a large part of our export markets. We have explained to you how huge huge this economic cost is going to be to us, that it is simply not enough for them to come out here and say the USA is going to want to fund us. What is actually going to happen is that because China wants to maintain good optics, which they did not negate, they are likely to just cut us off entirely. They have threatened to do so already multiple times with Australia, and it will simply take one last straw before they do so entirely. But we're not just talking about conflicts, right? We are also talking about things like climate change. A lot of the material, the unique material about like other countries going vegan and no longer wanting milk, like just wasn't responded to, and that still exists, and the USA just simply can't buy us out of that because it is likely to also affect them. Basically, what I explained to you is that there is not enough assistance or way to avoid the extreme harms of being cut off and being like left alone and having to fend for ourselves. It is better that we start working up and building a sufficient economy now than having to try and do it and flip when it comes to it in the future. So what does it come to then is that we have to diversify and we have to get stronger and we have to fund our like regional economies. I think I'm just going to walk you through how we have proved this in this debate. Firstly, we told you that we are going to do subsidies and applied like trade tariffs, all the things in the motion. Bex told you that we simply have the fiat to do this, or we can just tax the rich and we'll do it anyway. Secondly, this means that we now have less startup costs for businesses to be able to operate. And we've told you how we're therefore likely to get more businesses because cost is no longer a barrier. More businesses means that they are able to compete more, which means that they are likely to get lower costs, but they're having to compete more for wages for employees. They're likely to generate more New Zealand specific products. They're likely to be of a higher quality than the crappy products we get from China. These were all of the benefits we have proved to you throughout this debate. Ultimately, what it comes down to is that And so basically what this comes down to then is all of these outcomes that we have proven throughout the debate is that we are not only now independent, like a lot more independent than they ever will be on their side of the house because they continue this globalization, they continue this spiraling effect, but also they were also talking about how it's a global world and how we are not only just caring about New Zealand. I think this is where all of our material about sanctioning foreign countries comes in which we are simply unable to do that on their side of the house when you lose out on that market entirely. If we can't prove to you that things like climate change and war will harm economic shocks, our ability to sanction foreign countries most certainly will.
Congratulations everyone on making it through to the end of the preliminary rounds. Invite you to cross the floor and shake hands. And then that's us.
Amazing, guys.
Okay, maybe repair.